Okay, as I was saying in our last session, there's automatic recording and there's automatic processing and encoding, and there's effortful where it requires rehearsal. One of the problems that happens with students is that we think the information is going to be automatic and we don't need to study it, but we come to the exam and we find out that it should have been effortful encoding, which required rehearsal, may have required 7 rehearsals to fully understand the information. So try to learn how to discern when the information is really automatic and when the information is effortful in order to encode. One of the ways you can do that is most of your textbooks now have built-in questions along the way on the different sections. And if you really pause, yes, and I'm hoping you really read your textbook. If you really pause and ask yourself the question and try to come up with the answer to it, then you've checked to see whether the information was automatic encoded or whether you needed to do some rehearsal for it. Students are often hesitant to test themselves because if they find out they don't know it, then they feel kind of guilty not going back and learning it. They find out they don't know it and they have to go back and learn it, they're kind of bummed. So they don't test themselves and they just hope that they actually know it. Okay, here's a clicker question. Rehearsal is the conscious repetition of information. It is part of, is that automatic processing, effortful processing, forgetting, or retrieval? What do you think? Yep, effortful processing. I hope you all got that because it feels good to be right. Okay, now we'll talk about theories of forgetting because forgetting can occur at 3 points along the pathway from stimulus to memory. All right, and they are the points: faulty acquisition. You might have actually learned it incorrectly, or it failed to encode because of interference, or it's in your long-term memory, but you're having retrieval failure. Okay, so these are situations where you say, wait a minute, you write something down on an exam and it turns out to be wrong, and you go to the instructor and say, but I knew this. And they say, well, I believe that you do know that, but the way you learned it is not correct. And that's a terrible feeling. So to combat this, you should rehearse information right after you've learned it so that there's no time for misconceptions to enter and give you faulty acquisition. Failure to encode, that is where interference happens and consolidation isn't taking place, so it actually doesn't end up in your long-term memory. And the way you deal with that is test yourself. Try to make sure that it's actually in your long-term memory. And then retrieval failure, the way that you can prevent that is by practicing retrieving the information, or make yourself a retrieval cue that reminds you of the information. Let's say there's a 5-step process you have to remember in science or something. Maybe you can imagine the steps 1 through 5 are on your thumb through your pinky, and you're looking at your hand and you're seeing those steps on your fingers. Your fingers become your retrieval cue so that you can actually get the information out. This is the horrible experience where you can't remember it during the test and then you walk out the door and then boom, it's there. So it encoded, but you just didn't have a good system for retrieving the information. So when memories are stored in a self-enhancing manner, it's also called egocentric bias. So you know how when people kind of remember things in a way that's favorable to them, like they thought that they did a really good thing at the party or whatever, that's called egocentric bias. And there's a question about that on your test. Okay, so here's our memory diagram again. A stimulus, a phone number. I pay attention because I want to know this person's phone number. It goes into my sensory storage. It'll only be there 250 milliseconds. So it's going to be either stored visually or in an auditory way. And for me, I'm an auditory learner, so I'm rehearsing that number over and over again. Because it has meaning for me, it's going to go into my short-term memory. Thankfully, my memory can hold 7 items, plus or minus 2, so 9 doesn't quite get us to a 10-digit phone number, including area code. So we have to chunk into 3 sections. So it'd be 209-883-2967. So that's 3 chunks to get 10 items into our short-term memory. I would be listening to the sounds of those numbers over and over again, and I'd be concerned because it's lasting less than a minute. But I do 7 rehearsals of that phone number, and it goes into my long-term memory, which is infinite in capacity. That phone number is stored, and it's called an engram or a memory trace, how it's stored. I now allow 15 minutes of consolidation where I do nothing intellectually challenging. I do mindless things. I look at my Instagram, I channel surf, I play with the dog, I go eat. Something that is not competing with storing information in my long-term memory. And if I do that successfully, then I recall, I don't forget. That determines my performance. Okay, faulty acquisition, one of the problems in forgetting, occurs here where we think we're learning the information correctly, we're rehearsing it. Somebody says, okay, let's meet at the restaurant at 3 o'clock. And you start going, okay, gotta remember, I gotta be there at 3, gotta be there at 3. When actually what they had said was 3:30 or 4 or 2 o'clock, and you just misheard them. So faulty acquisition, you show up, you thought you remembered it correctly. You show up at the time you expected to be there, but they're not there. So that's faulty acquisition. Then failure to encode occurs here. It's in long-term memory. You've rehearsed it 7 times. You've put it into your long-term memory, so it's there, but it doesn't encode because consolidation doesn't take effect. Maybe right after you heard that phone number, somebody texts you with some really dramatic information, and that wipes out the phone number in favor of the new information, so you forget. Or retrieval failure. When you bring information from your long-term memory back into your short-term or working memory so that you can talk about it, write about it, recall it in some way, you can't get it from your short-term memory back into your long-term memory back into your short-term memory. That's called retrieval failure. So you know this person's name, you knew it when you were in high school. You go to the reunion and they're not wearing a name tag, and you go, oh, hi, how you doing? And you cannot recall their name. You know it because you had to know it a long time ago in high school, or for some of you it's not that long, and you're just having failure to retrieve that information because there's no solid retrieval cue. So on your memory diagram, you guys can write faulty acquisition, failure to encode, and retrieval failure at the appropriate places in your diagram. You might want to pause and pencil that in right now. Okay, here's another way to look at it. Some of you want a simpler linear picture, and I provide a lot of pictures in this area because many of you are visual learners, and it really helps you a lot to see exactly what I'm talking about and not just hear about the details. So note the storage systems and the active behaviors that move memory along the pathway to long-term memory. External events, what are those called? Right, stimuli. Sensory input ends up in sensory memory. Paying attention to important or novel information causes the information to go into short-term memory. Encoding allows it to go into long-term memory. Retrieving it, bringing it back into short-term memory allows you to work with the information. So here's faulty acquisition that takes place before short-term memory can actually memorize the correct information. Encoding is taking place here. Encoding is taking place here. Retrieval failure could be taking place here. So there's another diagram that some of you might like. You might pause the video and take a good look at it. Say what I just said. In fact, it'd be good to go back to this one and say what I said so that you can start to rehearse what your answer would be using your example instead of mine. Okay, so what might cause forgetting? Faulty acquisition, failure to encode, and retrieval failure. So just pause the video again right here for a minute and think about that this isn't something that you have to just memorize. When you understand how memory works, these 3 ideas about why we forget make sense. And it's important for you to know about faulty acquisition, failure to encode, and retrieval failure, because you can build things into your learning process to combat these 3 types of forgetting. Okay, so one of the reasons things fail to encode is due to interference. So learning some items may disrupt retrieval of other information. And this can happen in 2 ways. Proactive interference, which is forward acting. And I'll give you examples because this really doesn't mean a lot. Disruptive effect of prior learning on recall of new information. And it can be retroactive or backwards acting interference. And that means disruptive effect of new learning on recall of old information. Oh my goodness, without examples, none of this really makes sense. So pause the video, get yourself some notes written down, and then move on to the next one. Here's our example. Here's our learner, okay? So proactive interference. She's studying her French. Then she studies her Spanish. Then she has a Spanish midterm. French and Spanish are a little bit similar, but enough different that if you studied French right before you study your Spanish, and then you take your Spanish exam, this information is trying to consolidate when you go and study this information, which then tries to consolidate, and having studied this right before you study this interferes with your performance. That's proactive interference. You don't really have to know this for a test or anything, but I really want you to factor it into your own studying. Okay, here she is studying her French again. Then she studies her Spanish, but now she takes her French test. Studying Spanish in between studying French and being tested on French might retroactively go back to interfere with the French. So some things are positive transfer. In this case, we have negative transfer causing interference with the long-term memory of either the French or the Spanish. Now, as you might have noticed in my introduction, Big Bang Theory was one of my favorite shows. So here is a good example of Sheldon's eidetic imagery. And here we go. We'll try to skip the ad and get into it.
Fun? Are we going to talk or are we going to play Mystic Warlords of Ka'a?
Just play a potion card.
Which one?
It doesn't matter. You can't possibly win. Sheldon, don't ruin the game.
How could you ruin the game?
Given the cards that have already been played, Penny can only be holding Necromancer potions, which are only effective against Wraiths and Daywalkers, and there are no more of either left to be drawn. The cards remaining in the undrawn stack are 4 fire weapons, a troll, 2 ogres, and the Jewel of Osiris. See? Ruined.
Sheldon, that is incredible.
From your vantage point, it certainly must seem so. Sheldon has kind of a photographic memory. Photographic is a misnomer. I have an eidetic memory, as I've told you many times. Most recently, last year, during lunch on the afternoon of May 7th. You had turkey and complained it was dry. Well, I guess game's over.
Really? Oh, great. I mean, oh.
Okay, I love these guys and I miss them very much. It's too bad that show is over. Okay, so again, eidetic imagery.
It's been 25 years
Hey!
since we first met Monica, Chandler, Joe.
As I was saying before, something magically interrupted us. I really did love Big Bang Theory. They referred to psychology a lot, Now, Sheldon said that psychology wasn't a real science and only physics and stuff were real sciences, but then he would use it all the time. And I have a few